Yeah, okay. So this talk is partly about the 5 million year Odyssey. That book now, of course, that came out in 2022, so it's already here and there getting out of date. This first Farmers came out 2023 as a second edition, and I'm now working on a new one for First Migrants. After that, I think I might give it all up and have a rest. But as I said, it is getting much more and more difficult to try and cover everything. It is just there's some huge amounts of information. So I'm going to talk today about, well, everything through the hominin period, I mean, back to 5, 6 more million years ago, but I will also talk about a few American topics, settlement of the Americas, farming populations, and of course, we now know from DNA that there were some very minor contacts with Polynesia. They weren't huge, nowhere near as big as Tor Heyerdahl thought, but they did happen. And two comments I'll start with. For me, migration is one of the most interesting things about humanity. There was a time when archaeologists refused to discuss it. But of course, if you think about humans compared to, say, chimpanzees, chimpanzees have never really migrated beyond the African rainforest, and they're still there now in small numbers, rather threatened. Humans went everywhere. So without migration, of course, we wouldn't exist as humans. I mean, that's obvious. The second point I'd make is that, yes, as I said before, I do compare. Well, I try to sort of triangulate. That's a word that I think Pat Kirch in Berkeley used it for the Polynesians 20 years ago or so. It's a good term. We're not trying to prove anything, at least not in terms of broad historical hypotheses. We're trying to overlay results from biology, genetics, skeletons, whatever, archaeology and linguistics to see what sort of best fit hypotheses we can find. And I think that's about the best we're ever going to do for many things, like, where does farming come from? Where do Indo-Europeans come from? Where do Uto-Aztecans come from? And all that sort of thing. We're never going to know precisely, but we can look at what the most likely possibilities are. Now, when I wrote the Odyssey, I put human prehistory, or hominin prehistory, I should say, into 4 acts. The first one down here, where's my little pointer? Here we are. Okay, I mean, humans and chimpanzees and bonobos split, between 6 and 9 million years ago. Humans went on to become bipedal, hand-using and large-brained creatures. Chimpanzees evolved in the African rainforest to become knuckle-walking, rather small-brained creatures who are still there. Bonobos split from them, I gather, about 2 million years ago as a result of crossing the Congo River. They crossed and then could never get back, so they gradually became what are called separate species. I'll come on to that species business in a moment because it's fairly important. The second act is the appearance of the genus Homo. The classification of Homo is fairly fuzzy. I mean, to me, late Australopithecines and early Homo are pretty much the same thing. But paleoanthropologists, of course, they're armed with large numbers of measurements that they think are terribly significant. And everybody seems to have agreed that the genus Homo emerged about 2.5 million years ago. There's increasing sign of use of stone tools then, although Australopithecines do seem to have used them as well. A lot of the evidence is somewhat uncertain. 2 million years ago, the genus Homo left Africa. And that was a sort of big bang, because then the distribution of humanity literally more than doubled. Africa into Europe and Asia. They didn't get any further for a long time until modern humans came along, but certainly the Europe and Asian continents more than doubled the extent of early hominins. There's a lot of overlap between the later Australopithecines, or the Paranthropines. Can you see this arrow?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I'll just use that because I seem to have lost the pointer. Then we might get the first sea crossings in human prehistory to small islands in Indonesia that had tiny hominins particularly Luzon in the Philippines and Flores in eastern Indonesia, where there are small quantities of human bone and stone tools that are as much as 1,000,000 years ago. And those islands were never joined to Asia. Then in the middle part of Act 2, we have quite a major change. The appearance of large-brained hominins, who include our ancestors, Homo sapiens in Africa, and the Neanderthals, and these strange people called the Denisovans, who were first found in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains in southern Siberia, now, of course, part of Russia. And much of the time span after, let's say, 1,000,000 years ago, is tied up with the activities of Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. And Denisovans and Neanderthals, of course, are only in Asia, not in Africa. Indigenous or deeply indigenous Africans don't carry the Neanderthal DNA that most Eurasians do. Many Africans do carry Neanderthal DNA, but that's because people went back to Africa in later times, of course. But now, the sapiens, when did our ancestors get out of Africa? Well, I think in terms of modern humans, it's probably about 50 or 60,000 years ago. But there are these many skeletal remains that are called early Homo sapiens. We'll look at those in a moment. And we start to get evidence for burials and things like blade tools and bifaces in southern Africa. So that things are starting to heat up in Africa after 300,000 years ago, and certainly by 100,000 years ago. There is a change of scale here. These are 500,000, whereas this is a different scale down here. Now, coming on to the next slide, where I changed the scale again, we have the settlement of Australia, which I think was probably 50,000 years ago. I'll come back. That's a very important question. I'll come back to that later. The oldest rock art in Indonesia, well, now it's actually 51,000 years ago. This is uranium series dating of calcium carbonate crust that is covering paintings on limestone cave walls. The calcium carbonate, of course, runs down to be precipitated by water as stalagmite, and it can be dated through uranium series. Arctic colonization, yes, I mean, we're now getting into modern humans, of course. Since 55,000 years ago, modern humans replace other hominins like Neanderthals and Denisovans, although their genes are still in us, but as complete creatures, they no longer survive. The last glacial maximum, pretty frightful time, I think, when very large areas of northern Eurasia, including Siberia, and I think also probably including Beringia, were abandoned. Then the settlement of the Americas. I'll come back to that in a moment. I do see it as happening after the last glaciation with the melting of the ice sheets. If there'd been humans in the Americas at, say, 30 or 40,000 years ago, because of the sheer quantity of naive food in the American continents, those humans would be most unlikely or very unlucky to have died out completely. To me, the pre-LGM record is not very convincing. Well, then we come into the Pleistocene, the Holocene, and agriculture. And I think I won't go into that at the moment. Right. Now I have to, why can't I change my slide? Something has, okay. Okay, all of a sudden I wasn't pressing the button hard enough. Where did humans evolve? Well, the story, of course, is best known from these regions that lie down the eastern side of Africa, the Great Rift Valley, and the many limestone caves that occur in South Africa. But this isn't necessarily where humans separated from chimpanzees, exactly where that
Sorry,
happened.
I'm seeing someone else's share.
There.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, now I see your.
Can everyone see mine?
Yes.
It's
Okay.
corrected now. We're good.
Okay.
We can now.
Yeah, yes, it's good now. Looks good.
Okay, well, one thing I will point out about, of course, all of these sites, some of which are very famous, like Olduvai Gorge, is that here they're in relatively horizontal geology, where there's a great deal of dissection of the landscape because of rift formation, and stone tools and bones can be found quite easily. And they have been, of course, in very large numbers. Down here, in all of these limestone caves filled with breccia and stone tools and bones, it's very possible to excavate large numbers of human remains, as long as you can find the caves. Sometimes the caves are very difficult to access. So in Africa, yeah, okay, a split from chimpanzees and bonobos, maybe between 6 and 9 million years ago. That's certainly not my research. I'm reading primatologists about this. And bonobos splitting from chimpanzees maybe 2 million years ago as a result of crossing the Congo River. But bonobos and chimps can still interbreed, I understand. So this is an interesting question. What exactly were these species, and to what extent were they separate? I suspect that Australopithecines lived across most of Africa, maybe not in the most intense parts of the Sahara Desert, but this Australopithecus here, which is in a pretty dry area now, presumably was living there when the climate was somewhat wetter. I think they were probably all over Africa, but when did they get out? And how did they get out? Through Sinai, there's rather barren dry land, and this tiny sea passage here called the Bab el Mandeb, which I think was always sea. It might have been very narrow, but I don't think it was ever completely dry land as I understand the geology. We'll look at that in a moment. Hominins getting out of Africa. Well, it looks like they left by 2 million years ago. This site of Shangchen near Beijing and Lantien, they both have remains of, well, the Shangchen has stone tools that were dated a few years ago to 2 million years ago. This site of Dmanisi in Georgia, which I visited about 15 years ago, does have 5 very small-brained hominins that are about 1.8. Well, they're younger than 1.8 million years old because they're in sediments that sit on a lava flow that is dated to 1.8 million years ago. So humans got out of Africa sometime around 1.8 million years ago. This is the distribution of the kinds, the bifacial stone tools called the Acheulean. They do go right up into the Altai Mountains, according to Russian archaeologists. They don't get much further, but of course, many sites over here in Eastern Asia do have occasional bifaces. So this is the so-called Mobius line. This causes a lot of argument. We don't need to spend time on it right now. But the thing I have been thinking about more recently, you'll see I put in an arrow here for the main sort of tropical latitude dispersal of first hominins towards Indonesia, Homo erectus in Java, China. But when you look at a map like this, you realize that some of these early hominins got to very cold places. I mean, Shangchen is near Beijing. Winters there are not fun if you don't have any clothing. Well, not for us at least. Even Southern Africa, South Africa, has cold winters. I've never been to South Africa, but I know that during the middle of winter, it can freeze at night, go below 0. I mean, it's not tropical. So early hominins, yes, how did they manage these cold climates? It wouldn't have mattered in Indonesia. It's hot all the time because it's right pretty much on the equator. And did hominins, in fact, follow this steppe route that goes right through from Eastern Europe into Mongolia? We come back to this question again with Homo sapiens. I think they did. This would have been open country. And of course, there are all of these early remains in the Altai Mountains, which are in the middle of the steppes. So they probably went in 2 directions, with, of course, the huge mountains and deserts like the Taklamakan Desert here and the Himalayas that would have been difficult for them to get straight through. This map also shows I'll come back to this later, the coastal shelves that would have been exposed during glacial periods. That's quite an important topic. I've listed a number of questions. I'm not going to go into all of these species. I'm not a paleoanthropologist. There are many species, Australopithecines, that presumably evolve into Homo about 2.5 million years ago. And then early Homo spread beyond Africa into Dmanisi in Georgia and the Cagayan River Valley in northern Luzon. Then we've got Homo erectus in China and Java, and then these large brain middle Pleistocene Homo, particularly Neanderthals and Denisovans, and then early Sapiens, which presumably, it is thought, stayed in Africa while the Neanderthals and Denisovans evolved in Eurasia. But a number of questions come up. Well, this business about regional continuity versus out of Africa replacement, I think we now know that it's a bit of each. Of course, there's quite a bit of regional continuity, but every now and again there were bursts of migration coming out of Africa. And I'll come on to a couple of the later ones soon. What exactly were these species? Paleoanthropologists named them according to the particular bones that they happen to have found. And a lot of it, of course, is kind of random. Were they really separate species in terms of reproductive isolation? Or did they all interbreed to some degree, like horses and donkeys producing mules, which are sterile, but they can still be reproduced? And we know that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens were interbreeding on several occasions, particularly in the last 50,000 years. And that does affect things in a way. All of these species names, they're useful handles. We have to have them to be able to agree what it is that we're talking about. We can't just call them Homo SP and forget about divisions. There are always going to be these species divisions, but of course there'll always be debate about what evolved into what and how different they are, plus huge gaps in the record. How long did hominins require to lose the ability to interbreed with members of cousin species? A lot of that is to do with separation. Let's think about horses and donkeys. Donkeys are North African, horses are Asian. They can interbreed, but they didn't until humans came along and domesticated them and then mixed them up. In other words, in the pre-human world, species would have formed, of course, through isolation. But humans, because of their capacity for migration, and also, I suppose, their capacity to move animals around, changed a lot of this complete separation into different species. Did humans ever lose the ability or hominins, I should say, to interbreed with each other? No, probably not. I doubt whether, let's say, Homo erectus could interbreed with a paranthropine, a robust Australopithecine, but we don't know because these back beyond 400,000 years ago, there's no ancient DNA, so there is no clear record of what exactly was going on. But it is clear, of course, yes, humans evolved in Africa, they got out of Africa, and they evolved into early forms of Homo in Eurasia. And then these middle Pleistocene large-brained ones came out and replaced the earlier ones as the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And there's also this issue about cold tolerance. Sorry, my phone is just ringing and okay, my wife will answer it. Okay. Now, well, yes, how different are species? Well, you can see here very clearly a human on the left from the Museum of Natural History in Washington, a Neanderthal on the right. There are major differences. Neanderthals had similar brain size to us, but their cranial shapes were quite different from ours. Here is a Neanderthal here from Israel, thought to be about 50,000 years old, 55,000. Here is a modern human with a very globular brain case, representative of us today. And when I think about the fossil record, I don't see really any evidence for humans with this kind of brain shape and this kind of retracted face that we have until about 55,000 years ago. I don't think hominins like this, or Homo sapiens, modern humans, were sitting around at about 100,000 years ago. The fossils that some people claim to be early Homo sapiens are actually quite different in shape. They have much more elongated brain cases overlapping with Neanderthals. You can see here at the top the difference between a late Australopithecine from South Africa and an early Homo. There's a new paper going to come out going back to calling it Homo georgicus, because Dmanisi is in Georgia. Many people call it Homo erectus, but there's not a huge amount of difference. Not to someone like me, who is not a professional paleoanthropologist. I'm sure there are measurements that differ, but this is the Dmanisi has 5 of these very small crania. The latest view, I'm just going to shut my door because my wife is talking on the phone. I'm going to have to shut you out, Claude, sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, I've just shut my office door. Yeah. So this is the evolution from late Australopithecine to early Homo. Nothing too dramatic, but a considerable average increase in the size of the brain over a few 100,000 years. Now, where do these fossils come from? Well, a few years ago, I visited Atapuerca, which is a very famous location in northern Spain. And new fossils are being reported from here now in Europe, back to, I think the oldest one now from the Cima del Elefante, I think it is about 1.5 million years ago. But where do fossils come from? In the 19th century, you see this limestone here. This is a limestone hill, and a mining company dug a railway line through the limestone. It was a mining company. They've long since closed down. But when they cut this deep channel through the limestone, in the walls of the channel, all of these completely filled, breccia-filled caves deep within the massif were exposed at the time. I suppose no one bothered about them, but once archaeologists realized what was in there, they started excavating, and of course large numbers of these caves have now turned up. You can see this one, here's the roof of the cave, was completely filled with sediment. It must have washed in from outside, completely filled right up to the ceiling. But down here are these layers that have hominin remains and stone tools, and the railway cutting is very handy for storing all the tools. Another question that comes up is, I mean, do lithic technologies equate with separate hominin species? I don't think so. Part of the problem there is, of course, that the hominin species themselves are very fuzzily defined. Every time someone finds a new set of bones, there's a lot of discussion about how one species integrates with another and so forth. And I don't really see, if you take something like an Acheulean hand axe, well, of course, in Africa, they're associated with Homo erectus, but I'm pretty sure that early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, the hand axes were made in the Mousterian lithic assemblages of the Neanderthals. They don't really fit with any specific kind of hominin. They're just part of the lower and middle Pleistocene landscape. Most humans made them. They didn't make them in Southeast Asia. They made sort of pebble tools and choppers and things there instead, but that's just the way it was, I suppose. The fashion didn't spread that far. With middle Pleistocene hominins like Neanderthals and also early Homo sapiens, they made these so-called Levallois tortoise-shaped cores where they flaked, this is all flint, English flint, I think, yeah. They flaked a core to look like a tortoise shell and set up a striking platform with the intention of striking off a large flake to some sort of preconceived shape. Modern humans, early ones, and Neanderthals, and the Denisovans as well, I'm sure, could do this. This is a Mousterian side scraper, Mousterian Neanderthal, of course, it's a cast of one from France, but you find things like this all over East and Southeast Asia, even Australia. I mean, especially in Tasmania, where the weather was cold and people were scraping skins, these kind of scrapers are universal there. And with the blade industries that are often associated with Homo sapiens, here's a prismatic core, and here's a long, narrow blade. Yes, it is true that most of these prismatic blade industries were made by Homo sapiens when they're associated with human bones. But there are many situations like in Australia and Southeast Asia and southern China, where definite early Homo sapiens did not make such tools. They made simple flake tools instead. And I think when it comes to these blade tools, like item D, it is an association with cold weather. When people need clothing and shelter, they have to make more elaborate tools. I mean, some of the most elaborate stone tools and artifacts, of course, are associated with Arctic populations, as you will probably all know in the ethnographic record. There's a good reason for that. In Africa, the oldest blades and back blades and bifaces and all that sort of thing are in the far south of the continent, although I know there are some turning up now in the tropical areas, but they are best known from South Africa, the coastline, caves on the coastline of South Africa. So the Upper Paleolithic, as it's called, it is associated with modern humans, but not with all of them, and not necessarily with the first ones. Now, how did modern humans get out of Africa and when? Well, this map, this is not in the 5 million year Odyssey. This is a map I created recently for my new version of First Migrants. I think it all happened something like this. I mean, I've put the origin somewhere, because we know about East Africa and South Africa. We really don't know what was going on over here. Early modern humans could have been all over Africa, and I think a lot of the geneticists now are coming to that conclusion. So let's not worry about exactly where, but the best way to get out, of course, is through these two passageways, Sinai and through the southern part of Arabia. Pretty desperate country there, but some archaeologists do favour that route across the Bab el Mandab. But some of them, we know now from ancient DNA, also took the steppe route, reaching Yana on the Arctic Circle by about 40,000, 35,000 years ago. And they came down into northern China. So it's like a pincer movement, a tropical movement here that goes into Australia, and which today survives in the world as the indigenous people of New Guinea and Australia, who are genetically and linguistically very separate from most of the people who live in Eastern Asia and the Pacific. These are indigenous Papuan speaking New Guinea Highlanders, and of course indigenous Australians, including Tasmanians. They are a distinctive population which descends, I think most geneticists would certainly agree with this, and archaeologists, they descend from this tropical migration of Homo sapiens, not requiring any clothing. It's pretty much hot everywhere, but it does get cold down here in Tasmania. People were living there in the last glacial maximum, and there are lots of those scraper type stone tools in caves down in Tasmania. They were no doubt wrapping themselves in the skins of kangaroos and other marsupials to keep warm. So this, I think, is probably the track of the Homo sapiens track. And notice this one here. I think this is the way the Americas were settled, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I don't think they came straight out of the middle of Siberia, like Lake Baikal, and whizzed all the way over here. And the Yana people up here, their DNA, I understand, is not the most likely ancestor for the first Americans. Okay, and of course, as these modern humans migrated, so they met the Neanderthals and Denisovans. The eastern limit of Denisovans is quite fuzzy, but I just opened, I think it was in Science or somewhere, someone is now claiming to have found a Denisovan jawbone in the island of Taiwan. I still have to read the paper and think about it. Of course, indigenous people in New Guinea and Australia do carry quite a small proportion of Denisovan DNA. It's like Neanderthal DNA, 2 or 3% or something like that. But it is apparently relatively high in the eastern part of Southeast Asia and Australia. Okay. Now, this popped up the other day, and this is quite an amazing diagram. Now, it's what is called a georeferenced ancestral recombination graph. It's in Nature a couple of weeks ago or something. It's some incredibly technical statistical analysis of about 2,000 living human genomes from these populations here all over the world. And they claim to be able to track the ancestral movements of the ancestors of these 2,000 people, going back for not just Homo sapiens, but going back for 2 million years, right back to the beginnings of hominins, or since hominins came out of Africa. It's quite interesting. Whether they all went through the middle of the Himalayas like this, I do not know, but you'll notice that this branch going through Sinai is very powerful, and heading up north through the steppes. Modern humans in particular, I think a lot of them went that way, coming down into China. Going through the Bab el-Mandeb, no, not much evidence for that at all, according to these people. But the Sinai route, of course, did also power its way down through the tropical latitudes towards Australia. Whether it came through the tropics before it went through the steppes is not really clear. I mean, most of the good dates for early modern Homo sapiens all over Asia and Europe are around 50,000 years. I think the oldest date that I'm aware of for what is said to be a modern human, but it's only a tooth, is from a cave in France called Grotte Mondrin in the Rhone Valley. Most of the globular cranium-shaped modern humans like us are 50,000 years or less. This point here does look like an origin. I don't think it's intended to be. This is a modern sample, and it just so happens that they trace all the lines back. This movement, however, has puzzled me greatly, because I really don't know of any archaeological or genetic evidence that suggests that people migrated smack through the middle of the Sahara and up into Spain. In fact, recently there was an ancient DNA report from southern Libya of a pre-agricultural indigenous Siberian population. That's not, but a Sahara population, and it is not sub-Saharan African. It is an extinct population that apparently was native to the Sahara and that did not come from across the desert to the south. So this movement is a puzzle. I don't know where they've got that from, but that's probably what their wonderful algorithm does for them, produces things that may not be actually true. And I suppose we have to often be aware of this, even if we can't understand all of the algebra. This paper's full of algebraic formulae. It's quite amazing. I thought I'd put this on, land bridges. Here they are. Well, this is the 200-meter contour. It's slightly below where the sea level dropped to in the glacial maxima. That was about 125 meters, but big enough to expose these large sort of subcontinental areas. And look at the extent of all of this shelf up the eastern coast of Asia. I mean, it's not very helpful up here in the Arctic, but there's a lot of it in Western Europe as well, which probably was quite important, of course, for the movement of prehistoric humans. But this, Lewis Binford and Kent Flannery. Lewis Binford wrote a paper mostly about the beginnings of agriculture in the late 60s, saying that this sea level rise was incredibly important because it increased coastal productivity by leaps and bounds. During the glacial maximum, these shelves would have been exposed out to a rather plunging coastline, which would have been fairly barren. There would not have been major sea resources. When the sea rose 125 meters to flood its way right in here, of course, you have these huge areas of shallow coastal sea. Sunlight goes through it, corals grow, kelp grows up here, and I'll come on to kelp in a moment. And it makes a wonderful kind of situation for coastal peoples if they know how to exploit the offshore waters that they live near. And I'm pretty sure that they did. I mean, the first Americans must have done. Well, the first Americans, yes. I think I've looked at the DNA and the archaeology. Of course, Lake Baikal has some DNA, ancient DNA, that is said to resemble a first American ancient DNA. It probably does. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of sharing going on. But when I think about John Erlandson and his kelp highway hypothesis, it sort of strikes me that he's probably right. These areas would have had very high productivity. They would have been cold, but I'm sure people by this time, humans that say, 15 to 20,000 years ago, knew how to stitch and create tailored skin clothing. Whether they could weave textile clothing is another matter altogether, but certainly tailoring skin clothing like Arctic peoples do today, that knowledge was probably present. When I think about Siberia at the last glacial maximum, the archaeology suggests it was hardly populated at all. These sites are not last glacial maximum sites. And Beringia also, as far as I know, there were no sites that date from the last glacial maximum. There was no ice here. Alaska was not heavily glaciated because it's in the rain shadow of Siberia, which is a very dry area. Most of the ice, of course, was on the northwestern side of the Eurasian continent, where the winds and rain came in from the Atlantic. In North America, as you know, it's on the western side, of course, and right across to Greenland. But Alaska seems to have escaped the worst of the huge, thick glaciers. And I think that Japan, which I've visited many times, and I've looked at quite a lot of archaeology there, it has an incredibly dense archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, starting about 37,000 years ago, going right through to the Jomon period with its pottery. Japan was washed by a warm current that comes across the Pacific in tropical latitudes. It's called the Kuroshio current. It comes up the eastern side of the Philippines, up past the Ryukyu Islands, up past a branch goes up through into the Sea of Japan, but most of it goes up the coastline, then it goes back out into the Pacific. Japan has a very rich Upper Paleolithic record, and round about the last glacial maximum, people there were making those little microblades that are so common in Arctic latitudes, and they probably had quite a large population. They were also able to cross by sea to this Kozushima island to get obsidian. I think Japan was a kind of demographic powerhouse for humans. I'm not suggesting that everybody who went to Alaska came straight from Japan, but I think when the last glaciation started to retreat, the Japanese population began to expand up this coastline through Hokkaido, Sakhalin, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and eventually, probably with a certain degree of admixture, they reached the Beringian area and entered Alaska. And I think that would have been, from my understanding of the current archaeology of the Americas, about 16,000 years ago. I know there are sites like, White Sands in New Mexico and Chiquihuita Cave in highlands of Mexico, but I also know that a lot of archaeologists don't agree, and I've never been to those sites, but I have read quite a lot of papers about them, and I'm not that convinced. Whereas Cooper's Ferry, that has these western stemmed points like this one, which match very precisely this one here in Hokkaido, and Lauren Davis, of course, realized this, that could be quite important. So I suspect 16,000 years ago, and they get down here to Monteverde very quickly. It didn't, less than 1,000 years, I'm sure. I have been on this coastline here in northern Chile. It's very dry, the Atacama Desert. People probably move quite quickly through there because there's not an awful lot to keep them, I suppose. And once humans get their feet on the ground with all of these naive animals and other resources, I'm sure it wouldn't have taken them very long to get through both continents. It doesn't, I mean, it probably was only 1,000 years to get right down to the southern part of South America. They also got to these little channel islands they must have had boats, although quite well, getting through here, I suppose it would depend on how much, of course, the ice had retreated. These little fish hooks are found. They're found in the Ryukyu Islands of southern Japan in Pleistocene sites, also in eastern Indonesia by my colleague Sue O'Connor, and also in these channel islands. So these early first Americans also presumably went fishing, although sometimes when I look at these, and a number of them were found recently wrapped around a skull in a burial in eastern Indonesia, you wonder if in fact they're ornaments or things that went through people's ears. I'm not totally convinced that they're all fish hooks, but I won't argue too much about that at the moment because I'm not quite sure. Most Polynesian fish hooks, of course, had notches or grooves here so that the cord would attach tightly, but anyway. Now, when I saw Dale's flyer for my talk, I suddenly saw talk about the Chehalis River hypothesis. So I went into the internet and got the resource, and here it is. Yes, coming down the western side of the Cordilleran ice sheet and possibly through this corridor as well, which I gather was opened by about 13,000 years ago. And then, of course, getting into the interior where the Chehalis River is located, because obviously they couldn't do it further up here. Yes, I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and Alaska, of course, mostly unglaciated, which is a rain shadow effect, as far as I understand my climatology. Now, I should say also, the settlement of the Americas was the first great event in hominin or human prehistory that followed the last glacial maximum. Agriculture followed it, but it didn't come till quite a bit later, not until the beginning of the Holocene. The settlement of the Americas was the first sort of great burst out that took advantage of retreating ice. I mean, people in Europe certainly migrated back north again during the Ice Age, when ice was right down to the southern part of England, for instance. People went into these refugia in Spain and some parts of southeastern Europe and so on. As the ice retreated, they all moved back. But it's nothing like the scale of settling the Americas. So this was the first big event. Now, there's an awful lot here that I don't have time to cover. Agriculture. Why did agriculture develop? I think during the post-glacial period, the sea levels were rising, the productivity of the landscape was rising, rainfall and climate were increasing, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was increasing. There were more humans. More and more humans packing into, as I suppose Lewis Binford and Kent Flannery would have said many years ago, and even Mark Cohen with his, what was it, the population crisis in prehistory in the 1970s. I don't think human evolution is all about overpopulation. It's not about bursting at the seams, but human prehistory is about increasing population and a need to spread the results of evolution through a larger landscape by means of migration. That's what our past has been all about. Things evolve, and those things, if they are useful, if they have natural selection value in terms of the birth rate, they're going to spread, because the number of people will spread, and the genetic factor, of course, will also spread with them. Now, with agriculture, though this map shows the outer limits of prehistoric agriculture, yes, let's not forget, much of the world in 1492, that's a big date, Christopher Columbus. For me, that's the great break between the ancient world and the modern world. At 1492, agriculture was located somewhere within these dotted lines. Very large numbers of, Australia, Siberia. Now, of course, there were pastoralists up here. This is a good point. And I'll just make it quickly. It was something I was thinking about recently. When agricultural complexes spread from the Fertile Crescent, the Chinese Great River, the Yellow River, the New Guinea Highlands, Mesoamerica, when they spread, there were two sides to it. There were the plants, the crops. Most crops are sensitive to things like seasonal rainfall patterns and changing day length through the year. Crops are very much tied to latitudes. They may not be so much now because of scientific breeding, but for ancient people, crops and latitudes and climates were very much tied. Animals like cattle, sheep, goat, pigs, whatever, spread, well, llamas and alpacas never spread very far, but in the old world, the ruminant animals that could be used for milking, not pigs, but the other ones, sheep, goats and cattle, they just spread everywhere. They were not affected by climate. They didn't spread before they were domesticated for geographical factors. They lived in different parts of the world, but once humans domesticated them, they were off. And of course, domesticated cattle and sheep were taken right down through Eastern Africa into Khoisan speaking people, the Khoi herders, right down in the southwest part of Africa. The crops didn't go. The crops only got as far as central Sudan, because once you get into southern Africa, it becomes a monsoon climate with winter rainfall, and it's also very hot here. and the day lengths are quite different from the requirements of things like winter wheat and barley that were domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. So these are the limits of crop agriculture. Animals, well, animals will go wherever humans want to take them. And I'm sure many northern Siberian people have cattle, sheep, and horses too, of course, and right up far beyond the range of crop agriculture. Now, these are what might be called homelands of agriculture. Most paleobotanists and archaeologists agree that large numbers of very fertile and productive crops and animals were domesticated in these areas. Sugarcane and yams and aroids and things over here, rice, millets here, well, you name it in the Fertile Crescent. As Jared Diamond pointed out, a huge complex of animals and plants and legumes and flax and goodness knows what. Millets and yams and things down here. Here we've got manioc, quinoa in the Andes, potatoes, llamas, and alpacas, and maize. I mean, maize, wheat, and rice kind of drive the world nowadays. We all know that. I think, well, sugarcane does as well, of course, in terms of its role in fuel creation. But some areas were more important than others. Now, where I come from in England, no one domesticated any plants or animals, as far as we know. It doesn't count as one of these homelands. But that where I was a few months ago in central Turkey is quite different. That is a homeland, no question. No one doubts that. And what happened in these homeland regions? Well, populations grew, and you get effects like this. I was recently at a conference in a city called Urfa, Şanlıurfa in central Turkey. It was all about Göbekli Tepe, this site here. Wonderful site with beautiful carvings, T-shaped pillars set into sort of circular wall enclosures with what look like seats or whatever. Sometimes you get carvings. These are not a very clear slide. Beautifully shaped stone bowls. These people didn't make pottery, but they did know how to shape stone, quite hard stone. They must have had lathes or methods of turning the stone, because they're beautifully made. Oh, this is a site called Çayonu in eastern Turkey. This is Karahan Tepe, these two, and this is Şayberk, I think. Şayberk, I think, is this one. Human figures, carvings. These are phallic symbols carved out in the solid rock. This is solid, rather soft. Sort of, it looks like some sort of soft volcanic rock, but they've carved these phallic pillars into this pit. It's the same site as this one here. It's called Karahan Tepe. And again, you can see these T-shaped pillars in other parts of the site. These are big sites, and they're not with agriculture. They're at the very beginning of agriculture. Hunters and gatherers were increasing in numbers, getting busy carving things. They were starting to manipulate plants and animals. They were probably cultivating, clearing the land, burning, planting wild crops, wheat, barley, beans or peas and so forth, lentils. And eventually, as my colleague Dorian Fuller in London, a paleobotanist who writes a great deal about plant domestication, after a couple of thousand years or so, they managed to create these domesticated cereals, domesticated plants that are much more productive, much less reliant upon immediate environment than the wild ones. And the great thing about domesticated cereals and animals is that they can be packaged in a way and transported. Alfred Crosby, who wrote the book, The Ecological Imperialism, called this the portmanteau biota that allowed, of course, European colonists to flood the Americas and Australia with their crops and animals and do such disastrous things in terms of the indigenous populations. Yes, the portmanteau biota, to me, is epitomized by the Polynesians. They were all farmers. They filled their canoes with pigs, dogs, and chickens, and yams and taro. They didn't grow rice. And they sailed across, I think it's about 13,000 kilometers of sea eventually. It took them a few thousand years to do it, but when they eventually got to Easter Island, and then they got on to South America. That is now known genetically, and recently phytolith and starch analysis in a site called Anakenna in Easter Island has found starch grains of American crops, manioc in particular, sweet potato. There's no maize. And that's interesting to me. It suggests that it was not South Americans, and there's no pottery either. I don't think South Americans went to Easter Island. I think Eastern Polynesians went to South America in small numbers. They didn't have much impact. There's no real trace of them today in language or anything like that, but they got there, a few of them. I mean, it makes you think. You've all probably heard of Thor Heyerdahl and his wonderful theories about American Indians in the Pacific. Well, Heyerdahl didn't get it quite right, and he went out of vogue for many years. People forgot about it, but this new DNA and starch grain stuff is now bringing it back. Anyway, let's get back to the Middle East. Well, by 7000 BC, this is what happened, according to an artist. This is from the Abu Huraira report, about 7000 BC, pre-pottery Neolithic B. They still didn't make pottery. But if we believe the artists, they were growing crops and domesticating. Well, these are wild. These are antelopes or something. What are gazelle? I think they didn't domesticate them. Oh no, they're goats. I'm sorry, they're goats. Yeah, and these are, and here are the fields of wheat, and here are their little mud brick houses, all aligned very close to each other in sites like Chat Al Huyuk. They simply placed them all wall to wall, but here they appear to have been somewhat separate. And we go on for the next 7,000 or 9,000 years through, well, you name it, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, right down to Islam and everything else. I mean, this is the beginning of a huge chunk of global civilization. Christianity too, yes. They're all in there thousands of years after something like this. And the farmers spread through Europe. This is a fairly old map now, but from southeastern. Yes, somebody was raising the Black Sea. It was a lake. These migrations started about 6,500 BC and headed up into the Balkans and also around the north side of the Black Sea to where it is now an unfortunate region, of course, Ukraine and Western Russia. And others, they didn't get to Britain till about 4000 BC. The English Channel somehow held them up for 1,000 years. I don't understand that. It was flooded by this time. It was not dry land. But, and I'm just reading this morning some evidence that hunter-gatherers got to Malta down here. Why did it take them so long to get across there? I do not know. It's possible that the Mesolithic people, it's like the Romans. Julius Caesar went there and found the British Iron Age people defending the coastline. He stayed, he went there twice, but he never went back. And the Romans didn't go back for another 100 years until they conquered Britain under Claudius in AD 43. Those sorts of things happen. Things don't always go as you might expect them to. But anyway, this is moving through Europe. What role the Black Sea played, I don't know. When sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum, of course, they flooded through the Hellespont and the Bosporus, and the Black Sea got filled up with sea. Exactly when that happened, I can't tell you. Whether it was before or after 6,700 BC, which is when farming peoples living along this coastline here and in what is now the Istanbul region began to migrate into Greece and the Balkans. It probably did have an effect, yes. I mean, when it happened, the Black Sea would have filled up with sea. How quickly it filled up is not clear, but it would have filled up, and a lot of settlements around the ancient lake that must have existed would have been drowned. Whether anyone knows very much about that, I haven't heard any recently reported information from that area. The Chinese were doing the same thing, but completely independently. Here it was with rice and millet. The Chinese is a land of great rivers. It's very different from eastern Turkey. It's much wetter. It has a summer monsoon climate, quite different from the winter climate, winter rainfall of the Middle East. And it has these great rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow, and along the banks of not right on the main rivers because they flood disastrously, but in nicely sort of sheltered areas with smaller rivers like the Wei River here and small rivers down here. you find these early sites. Here is a reconstruction. This is actually the site called Banpo from Yangshao culture site about 5000 BC, northern China. These people were growers of foxtail and broomcorn millet. This is a reconstruction of a house from this site called Hermodu, which is a longhouse on stilts in a flat river basin. This is a modern reconstruction. This is some early pottery. This is from the site of Shangshan that has some of the oldest early domesticated rice in the world, going back to about 7000 BC. But rice didn't become sort of strongly domesticated until much later, maybe about 5000 BC. And this is Tianluoshan, an excavation covered by a roof. When I went there, the archaeologists, you can see all the house timbers here. This is all waterlogged, and this is where the idea of the stilts comes from. Hermodu has hundreds of them. It did, but they were all excavated, and I think they've all rotted away now because, of course, when they dry out, they don't survive. I looked at this thing here, and someone said, "Oh, it's a pottery workshop." Now I said, "What?" Since in your part of the world, I know in my part of the world, certainly in Polynesia, not so much in Australia, but in Maori, New Zealand, there are things called earth ovens. People dig a big hole in the ground, and I think they do it in the Americas too. They fill the hole with either stones, but here there's no stone, so they use big balls of clay. They light a fire, heat the whole thing up, and then chuck in a deer or a pig or something like that and cook it. It's an earth oven. And somehow the archaeologists have managed to leave it perched up on a pedestal. Anyway, it's still there. And I've been working in Southeast Asia in the last few years. We find all this wonderful stamped pottery in the Neolithic in Vietnam and southern China and Indonesia and so forth. Very similar to a lot of your fairly early formative pottery in the Americas. I'm looking at many of those wonderful little drawings in the James Ford book. What is it? The formative era or something in the Americas. And he's got lots of pictures of this kind of stuff. Early farmers just seem to have liked to decorate their pots in this way. I'm not sure there's much in the way of connection. These particular examples here are from Vietnam and Thailand, and they're probably 4,000 to 5,000 years old. And we find wonderful burials, always supine in Southeast Asia. And this is Kot Phnom Di in Thailand, excavated by Charles Hyam, with hundreds of thousands of these little tiny shell beads. And this is the nephrite bracelet. Jade, of course, was very popular in China. The Pacific was settled by people making this kind of pottery. They're called lapita in the Melanesian islands. Lots of dentate stamping, lots of little circles. Well, there were some here from Sulawesi Island in Indonesia, northern Philippines, Luzon, lapita itself on New Caledonia down here. This is a Luzon site as well up here, and also in the Mariana Islands. This is a site on Saipan Island here, which lies north of Guam. This ancient DNA has brought this area into a remarkable forefront. Here we are in America, just a minute. About 10 years ago, some of the lapita skeletons from sites in a particular site in Vanuatu were done over for their ancient DNA. And it turned out that the people who made this kind of pottery, the ancestral Polynesians, came from Philippines, Taiwan, South China. They're Austronesian-speaking populations, East Asian in their phenotype, and they became the Tahitians and Maoris of the ethnographic record. They migrated through these islands that were uninhabited. The Solomons had hunter-gatherers, and of course New Guinea was inhabited since 50,000 years ago. The Solomons probably at about the same time, and the Bismarcks here, New Britain. But New Caledonia, Fiji, Vanuatu were empty, and so were Samoa and Tonga, which are the western islands of Polynesia. So these Polynesian ancestral people migrated through with their lapita pottery and settled down for about 500 years, speaking probably a single language over a vast area, because they're probably speaking something that linguists would reconstruct as Proto-Malayo-Polynesian within the Austronesian family. But people in New Guinea had already started farming in the highlands. That's become clear from excavations by some of my colleagues here, Jack Golson and Tim Denham. They were draining and managing water in swamps to grow yams, sugarcane and bananas. It's not so clear if they grew taro. Taro is thought now, I think, to be genetically of Southeast Asian origin, but New Guinea does have apparently species of aroid, lily-like plants like taro that they might have domesticated. And the people, and that domestication probably spread into the Bismarck archipelago. So when this lot came through with their Malayo-Polynesian languages, the indigenous people who were already knew about farming suddenly realized, okay, well, they got these wonderful things, pigs, dogs, and chickens. We've never seen them before. We'll have a few, because they were all present in Lapita times. Their bones have been found in Vanuatu, for instance. And they took off. The indigenous Papuan people, with their sort of, indigenous Pleistocene DNA from the first settlement of these islands, adopted many of the crops and animals that these Lapita people were carrying, and they also adopted their languages, because all of the islands through here are Austronesian. And I think that happened because this area, New Guinea, would have had enormous linguistic diversity, because they've been settled for 50,000 years. But that here there was a simple lingua franca that they could use, probably with a vocabulary of 300 or 400 words. And these people from New Guinea and the Bismarcks adopted it and became the Melanesians of today. And 250 years ago, when Captain Cook was on his second voyage with Johann Reinhold Forster through the Pacific, they were collecting lists of words from Polynesians and Melanesians, and they knew that the languages in Vanuatu and, say, Tahiti or New Zealand were related. They all had the same basic vocabulary, lots and lots of it. But they were completely different in physical appearance. I mean, New Guinea Highlanders and Tahitians do not look very alike. And people, this is an obvious fact of biological anthropology. They didn't know why, although Cook and Forster did sort of guess that the Polynesian type people must have come from the Philippines, because they went up to Manila, which was a major port in those days. And now ancient DNA has shown them that, in fact, they were probably quite right. It's all got it quite exciting. Now, I also get quite excited when I look at the Americas. Back in 1975 and 76, I had a long sabbatical, something that university lecturers don't get much nowadays, but in those days, life was quite good, and I spent a semester at the University of Hawaii. And I traveled all over the Americas. I took all these photographs myself, everywhere. You can recognize many of the places, and Sacsayhuaman, Cusco, Machu Picchu, Palenque, Chichen Itza, Antula, Chavinda, Huantar here, Labna, incredible, beautifully. Well, I presume it's correctly reconstructed, but it is the most beautiful Maya, late Port Maya architecture, Teotihuacan, the old Mexico, Pan, of course, Cuicuilco, just outside Mexico City, and a wonderful site near Lima called El Paraiso, or Chuquitanta, one of the late pre-ceramic South American structures. I don't have time to say a lot about agriculture in the Americas. I suspect it went something like in this table here. Settling down to village life with a dependent on farming, well, it does appear to have started in as far as I can tell, really, in sort of Ecuador and the northern Andes, the Zania Valley and Real Alto and Caral, and of course the Valdivia sites in Ecuador. I think the dating is still accepted. Sometimes I wonder, are the dates right? But I think they are. In Mesoamerica, it's somewhat younger, about 2000 BC, even though maize started life in Mesoamerica. Some people say as a sort of a juice supplier like sugarcane to start with, not for its cob. The teosinte cob, I gather, you can eat when it's immature, when it's green, but you can't do much with it once it becomes mature. Then the maize was taken to southwestern Amazonia, where I gather it was improved. There must have been strong selection for the cob. Maize in coastal Peru. Yes, a lot of sites now have maize. The latest stuff I've read on this is suggesting that the improvement, the selection for the cob might have happened in southwestern Amazonia. And then it went back to Mesoamerica, where it's been picked up in caves in Belize by Doug Kennett and his colleagues. It's all incredibly interesting. There's also this issue, of course, that many of the big mound building groups in Eastern North America don't show much signs of having any agriculture. I've often wondered about that. Poverty Point, for instance, I presume it has no farming, but they did create some sizable structures, as I'm sure you all know. Adena and Hopewell, I would suspect, were connected with the Eastern woodland crop complex that Bruce Smith wrote so much about. I gather Bruce is now writing detective novels, but he did put all this early agriculture in the eastern US states on the map. But it was really maize, I think, in the eastern USA arriving during the first millennium AD that really started people off. I think most of the creation of things like the Iroquois and Siouan language families happened after the arrival of maize, when there was a great increase in the size of the populations. As for homelands of crops, of course, this is mostly from Dolores Piperno. But most of it is tropical. Most of the homelands in the Americas, except for the eastern woodland one. And don't forget the eastern woodland ones, these crops are, well, apart from sunflower and squash, but they're no longer, I mean, the chenopods are no longer of immense importance in the world, except for quinoa, which comes from the Andes. That's a chenopod, or a goosefoot. But these major American crops, all part of the Columbian exchange of Alfred Crosby after 1492. This lot went to Europe and the European lot came over here. These are their possible homelands. Well, Corral, I didn't go to Corral when it wasn't excavated like this. So this is an internet picture. This is the Arawak and Arawakan and Tupi language families, of course, were immensely migrant, spreading through vast areas up into the Caribbean in the case of the Arawak people. And the Tupi Guarani went all around the edge of the Brazilian Shield with all of these jay, or what appear to be indigenous populations inside them. And there are claims that this can be traced in pottery. I'm not an expert in this, I won't go into it, but it's all extremely interesting. I am very interested in the Southwest, the Uto-Aztecans. Now, I was a good friend of Jane Hill, a linguist who died in 1918, and Jane reconstructed Proto-Uto-Aztecan as having a Mesoamerican origin with maize. And as many archaeologists back in the early days were pointing out, how was it that the Uto-Aztecans included hunter-gatherers in the Great Basin, the Paiute and the Shoshone and so forth, and the Aztecs? Nobody could really work it out. It just seemed so conflicting. I think we know the answer. A lot of geneticists and linguists don't. There's a new linguistics paper that says they all came from the Mojave Desert, the Uto-Aztecans. I suspect that is a phylogenetic conclusion that's being driven by the languages that survive today, because after all, the languages spoken by the people who lived in all those wonderful pueblos in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and the Fremont people in Utah, they're no longer with us. They disappeared around about the 13th century. And they either moved east, or many of them were replaced by Athabascan, Apache, and Navajo populations coming down from Canada, probably coming down from where some of you are sitting right now, I would imagine, but not so long ago, only 400 or 500 years ago. In 2000, I went to Las Capas with Jonathan Mabry and thought, God, this is incredible. Little canals and underground bell-shaped storage pits, and there are house floors and things like that as well. Some of the storage pits in other sites apparently can big enough for 10,000 maize cobs. And this is all about going back to about 2000 BC. I think it's the migration northwards of Uto-Aztecan people from central Mexico. I know that, yes, there's a recent DNA paper looking at coastal Californians from near LA and comparing them with people who still speak Uto-Aztecan languages in northwest northwest Mexico. But the samples are, there were no samples from the Pueblo area. I mean, getting DNA from that part of the world, I know, is problematic because the indigenous people are, as in many parts of Australia, are not happy about having outsiders examining their ancestors and so forth. But I think I'm still a firm believer in this north movement of the Ute-Aztecans. On the right is the map of the eastern. I won't go any more into that, but those are some of the sites on the right-hand diagram that have the eastern woodland cultivated crops in the not Poverty Point, but these ones up here, through the research of Bruce Smith. I have become very interested in language families. I won't hold you up for much longer. Why were they significant? The thing about language families is that they've always been there. The Indo-Europeans were all the way from Ireland to Bangladesh long before any empires or written records. Alexander the Great, the Romans had nothing to do with it. Alexander the Great didn't spread Greek. Greek is not spoken in Central Asia. Alexander the Great had no impact at all on language history, to be quite honest. The Romans did, because they settled their retired soldiers in conquered provinces. That's why Latin spread, and that's why I think I read the other day 1,000 million people, if that's correct, still speak what I would call Latin. They do. I mean, we wouldn't call it Latin necessarily. We call it French, Spanish, whatever. But basically, language families spread with their speakers. Full stop, as far as I'm concerned. All this stuff about conquest, elite dominance, it never worked in history. The Normans never spread French into Britain. I know very well that a few conquerors are not going to make a large indigenous population of farmers or even herders change their language. People don't like changing languages. They have to if they migrate, but they do not just do it at the drop of a hat. I know people in England that suddenly say, all right, let's go and speak French tomorrow. I mean, those things just don't happen. So language families carry an enormous amount of history of languages. Now, there's no reason to assume here, of course, that the people who speak languages in a family are genetically identical. You think of the physical variation amongst Indo-European speakers, Northern Indians versus Scandinavians, for instance, more so amongst Afro-Asiatic speakers, Arabs and Hebrews, I mean, Israelis versus Ethiopians. And Austronesian, I mean, your Melanesian populations in the Solomon Islands and Filipinos, there's enormous physical variation. But languages are important. In the Americas, I'm not sure that I do need to go into this. Of course, I think this is probably where I would suggest that Ute-Aztecan, well, this is Jane Hill, somewhere close to the other indigenous Mesoamerican peoples who were growing maize, possibly 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But over on the right here, this is the Ute-Aztecan distribution. You can see it's quite enormous, all the way from, well, El Salvador down here somewhere. I gather there are some in El Salvador, but certainly eastern part of Mexico, up into almost the Canadian border, almost to where many of you are sitting now. And the Arawakan ones, very broken up here, but through into the Caribbean, and Tupian languages, of course, going all the way around this core area of eastern Brazil. But just as I think probably the final point, when I look at the old world, the distribution of languages is much more coherent than in the new, because in the new world, so many of them were removed, were simply wiped out by the arrival of the English, Portuguese, Spanish, and French. So that vast areas of the 1492 Americas no longer have the languages that were there before 1492. The old world is rather different because most of the populations, of course, have remained in place. They haven't been colonized, except in Australia and so forth, but that's a different story. These major language families, Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Bantu and Niger-Congo. This is a new name for many of the Central Asian languages, including Turkish. Sino-Tibetan, Kra-Dai, Austroasiatic, Khmer and Vietnamese, Austronesian all over the Pacific. Where do they all come from? I think they go back to these agricultural homelands, and this is where I would put their origins. Dravidian probably would have an origin somewhere towards the Fertile Crescent, towards the Iranian plateau. But most of them do come from within the area. This is millets and other crops, the sub-Saharan African crops, pearl millet, sorghum, finger millet, crops that were also carried across the Indian Ocean to the Indus Valley civilization about 2000 BC. Here, the Southwest Asia, Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic. Let me just, okay. And over here, of course, quite a large number of them, Sino-Tibetan being the core one, and the one that has spread the furthest and produced by far the largest population. But don't forget that most of China is conquest territory. The Sino-Tibetan people were up around the Yellow River until about 2,300 years ago, when the Chinese dynasties, the Qin and the Western and Eastern Han, when they conquered these large areas of China down around Hong Kong, round about 100 or 200 BC, and thousands of settlers spread south with the Chinese armies, overlaying the indigenous populations, who were, of course, the ancestors of these indigenous people, the Thais, the Khmers, the Vietnamese, and so forth, and the Austronesian people of the Pacific. For my new book, I'm engaging in a kind of exercise where I'm comparing what I would call food production complexes with the distributions of major language families. And I've got about 4 or 5 of them here. This is the Fertile Crescent crop complex, wheat, barley, etc., winter rainfall. It spreads into northern India. This is monsoon country here, so it took a while to spread, but its earliest spread, of course, was through the winter rainfall belt, Europe, Southwest Asia, North Africa, across to the Indus Valley. This is the East Asian millet and rice zone, which of course got to Madagascar because they came from Indonesia. And over here is the African, the sub-Saharan African millet and yam and groundnut and so forth zone. But of course, the cattle and sheep from the Fertile Crescent did spread right through this area, but the wheat and barley certainly didn't. And my suspicion here is that we can relate these language families, Austronesian, Sino-Tibetan, and the others, to the East Asian crop production complex over here, the Indo-European. I've taken Turkish out because that's a medieval migration, but Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic did correspond before, in early historical times, before 1492, with the spread of this Fertile Crescent complex. And the African one, of course, spread with the Bantu-speaking population from the Niger-Congo family. I tried at one point to do the same thing in the New World, but I won't necessarily go into that here. And just quickly, this is moving across the Pacific. I've mentioned this already. Yes, there were connections with South America about 1100 after Christ, it seems. And here's a little mystery for you. Yes, Easter Island, I went there in 1975. Remarkable, these flat-based busts with their hands, with their extended fingers across their stomachs, very angular faces. Here's one, and guess where it is? It's in Sulawesi, in the middle of Indonesia. It's unique, I think. Well, there are others a little bit like it. They have the same hand position. It's a bust. It's cut off at the midriff. This one is said to be female. It may or may not be, but the facial shape is somewhat, well, vaguely similar. This, in fact, is a row of beads over here. Quite what the beads were made of, we will never know. No one knows how old these things are in Sulawesi. In Easter Island, of course, they're quite recent. They're mostly, I think, 16th, 17th century, just prior to the arrival of Europeans. But this is quite interesting. This is Central Sulawesi. These are Austronesian-speaking people related to Rapa Nui or Easter Islanders. So this may be a kind of a memory of some very ancient way of representing human figures that has survived in both of those areas. Australia, finally, it is a hunter-gatherer continent. There have been suggestions recently that got very popular that Australians were farmers on the grounds that they manipulated their environment, replanted yams or burnt the landscape to encourage regrowth and animals. For me, the Australians were not farmers. They did not have domesticated crops or animals, except for the dingo, which of course is a dog. The dingo is the Southeast Asian domesticated dog. I think the Pita people brought it round the eastern end of New Guinea and down into Cape York Peninsula. There are many similarities in stone tools between much of Australia and Indonesia. But one thing I would point out is that the southern half or southern 2/3 of the continent of Australia has languages that are very closely related in terms of their vocabularies. They're called Pama-Nyungan. Most linguists think that they are a family, a genuine family that has expanded from a homeland that is usually placed over here near the Gulf of Carpentaria. And there are very similar stone tools in this part of Australia, back blades and little microliths. They're quite different from the bifacial points and totally different languages called non-Pama-Nyungan up here in Arnhem Land and the Kimberley region. And it seems that there was some sort of mid-Holocene spread here. It didn't get to Tasmania. Well, no one knows about Tasmanian languages. They have a very tragic story. They've disappeared altogether, but through a very brutal colonization there, killing. And there were attempts to protect them, but they didn't succeed really, even though there are today many Tasmanians who claim some Aboriginal descent. But this spread is very interesting to me. Outrigger canoes came into northeastern Australia, dingoes, yes, and a few other things, but there's no genetic evidence for, or at least not strong. There are hints in Y chromosomes, but because of the absence of ancient DNA so far from Australia for this prehistoric period, we cannot really see Pama-Nyungan languages as being a result of a migration. That's still open for discussion. Okay, well, I've discussed quite a lot. I hope I haven't gone on for too long, but I hope you haven't all gone to sleep or something like that. But I've sort of tried to just go through some of the points that are of interest to me and that some of you might also find of interest. So thank you very much for your attendance. Okay, and I will now, can you still hear me?
Yes, do you want to quit sharing and we'll go in?
I can stop screen sharing, can't I? Yeah, okay.
There we go.
If I do that, then I just get back to the video. Okay, all right.
Yeah, well, that's the luxury of our program. We have, you went just fine. You just maybe an hour and 15 minutes. But we have time for questions. Anybody have a question for Dr. Bellwood? I think Jamie did, Jamie Taylor. She wanted to know if you could talk about the transition between horticulture to agriculture. Does there have to be a plant or animal that has been domesticated to be an agriculturalist?
Well, that's all to do with the meaning of words. Yeah, I mean, agriculture is just a general word for food. I call it food production. Of course, horticulture is gardening, where usually a range of different crops are grown together in a field. Agriculture tends to be used for single crops like wheat, barley, and rice and so forth that are grown just by themselves in large quantities. Agriculture, as far as we know, food production, well, the oldest examples, of course, are in the Fertile Crescent with wheat and barley. Whether they, how they laid out their fields, whether they mixed them up with lentils and peas and broad beans and things that are also native to that area, nobody really knows. But the main point, I think, is that it did take a long time for the domesticated characteristics to become attached to these plants and the animals as well. It didn't happen overnight. It probably took a couple of thousand years, and there are many questions as to how deliberate it was. Were people actually selecting things purposefully, or were they just planting and the plants were changing by themselves? I think there was some purposeful selection. It's very hard to prove it. Dorian Fuller, who's written a lot about this, I think suspects that most of it was just sort of accidental, done without conscious intent. But I don't know. It's there are many questions about this.
Jamie, did you want to add to that? I don't know if you have your mic on.
No, that was very helpful, but I could add that also I was thinking about the use of fire, and that in my graduate studies, applying fire to the landscape, and it may not have domesticated the plants, but it may have certainly created the landscape to the point where we have ecosystems here like camas prairies that cannot exist on their own because they're grown over. And so in that way, it's like the landscape is domesticated, not the plant.
Yeah. Australians did burn the landscape, and Tasmanians, and a lot of early historical records mention that, cleared areas. Of course, they realized, Australia has dry climates, much like California, I suppose, and they probably realized that if you don't burn the landscape and if you allow all of the dead stuff to build up, when you do have a natural fire, it's going to be gigantic, and it very quickly gets out of control. I think this is what has been happening with a lot of these recent fires that have been in the news. There was a huge one in California, wasn't there? I think end of last year or sometime, that got out of control for a long time. So they were probably burning in the knowledge that not only would it induce new growth and attract animals, it would also make the fires that did occur less dangerous than they would have been if the landscape was covered in large piles of dead tree. I'm sure they were aware of that. And so, yes, I'm not a botanist, but the predominant eucalyptus forest of Australia, I have read, which is of course very fire resistant. I have certainly read that is a product of Aboriginal clearing, which has selected for the eucalypts that always grow back, and other kinds of trees that are not so fire resistant. I can't name any species for you, but they've disappeared. I think that is the general situation in Australia. So I think everywhere in the world, I suppose. And of course, humans clear landscape, and it has a major effect. And eventually the forest doesn't grow back anymore because the soil washes away, of course. And
yeah. I think what Jamie might be meaning in the Northwest Coast area, they often burn to get rid of pests, but to encourage the berry crops so that they stay open and don't have the weeds. And it's also in savannas around oak trees, which also gets rid of the pests and brings in camas. It was a form of horticulture in a way. I think we have a question from Robert. Raise your hand if you like, but Robert?
Hi. I can't, again, I want to just say how much I really love your book. Really, really amazing book. Thank you so much. I can't let you get away without talking a little bit more about the possible Japanese origin of the first Americans. And you talked about the Kelp Highway. And there was also, a book I read probably 20 years ago called The Zuni Enigma, which hypothesized a trans-Pacific route. And it sounds like you're talking about one that went close to the coast. And so, what can you tell us about that?
I don't think that, if we're talking about the first Americans, no, I don't think they went straight across the Pacific from Japan. No, they would have gone up. They wouldn't have gone directly from Japan to America, but Japan, I think, was a source of demographic growth of the human population because of its warm current. It has a warm, even during the last glacial maximum, it would have had a warmer climate than Siberia. And then there are these parallels in the stemmed points and late Upper Paleolithic stone tools between Japan and the Americas. And of course, as you know, in the northeastern part of Asia, things like those little boat-shaped microblade cores and bifacial tools are very common. They're found everywhere, right up as far as Kamchatka. So, I mean, Japan to me is sort of, it's rather like a demographic engine, I suppose. In other words, a refugium where populations would have seen through the last glacial maximum and then expanded from there. And some of them eventually got to the Americas. But I don't know, I wouldn't suggest that. The trouble is with Japan, the main islands, Honshu, Kyushu, and Hokkaido, and they have volcanic soils that are rather acid, and there's no survival of Upper Paleolithic human bone. There are Jomon burials, but Upper Paleolithic ones, there's virtually nothing. There are some from the Ryukyu Islands, from Okinawa, that has Pleistocene, late Pleistocene skeletons in caves, but they're not quite like the first Americans, although it is, of course, some of the first Americans, it is thought, carried that population Y marker that is thought to have come from Southeast Asia. That is quite possible because, of course, many of the early humans who came to Southeast Asia also migrated north into China, and the Jomon people have genetic and craniofacial overlap with, I gather, ancestral New Guinea and Australian populations. So, no, to me, Japan is a kind of an engine of demographic growth rather than a direct source.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I'd just like to say, your maps of when the sea level was much further down, kind of looks like a continental shelf movement, like you're showing across and carrying traditions like we see, like the stemmed points. And we also saw basketry that is in the Americas about 13,000 years ago. Diamond plated basketry that's very much like old styles in Japan. The Kelp Highway, I just want to add, John Erlandson has a very good idea there about moving along with the Kelp Highways. I think one thing he misses is I'm working with people who are like Macaw, who are deep sea fishermen. And the kelp is very important as an environment, but it's also your source of fish lines. Kelp is spread and dried and made into these hundreds of feet of fish line, which you need to go deep sea fishing. And I have a little bit here that we
has fiber. You mean yes?
But that's kelp fish line, which I think is. If you can you see it?
Yeah.
You can see the kinds of knots that were used that Boaz suggested. But if you're going to be moving along the coast, you got to get not just to the fish that are around the kelp, but out there that are deep. So I like the Kelp Highway. I think we have to add to it the importance of deep sea fishing for those people there. Have any thoughts about that?
Well, obviously they weren't eating the kelp, but the kelp would have attracted large numbers of fish and, I presume, crabs and other sea creatures that could be caught. Mind you, I suppose I don't know how much evidence there is for exploitation of marine products, even in late Pleistocene Japan. I've never really gone deeply into the literature whether people were out there fishing. And how much difference these inshore warm seas would have made to them. But because the Kelp Highway does go right round and comes right down to California, doesn't it? It is a pretty obvious route and source of food along the way. So no, I think it is very important. It's hard to explain it otherwise.
Yeah.
But as far as I can far as I know, it's still the case that Beringia, and for that matter, Alaska, don't have last glacial maximum archaeological sites, right? There's nothing has yet turned up. Neither does the far northeastern corner of Asia, as far as I know.
We have somebody here who's written with antiquity, in other words, about the blades that we see throughout the Northwest and down at the plateau. David, did you want to say anything about the blade? Mansell?
No, I really don't. Thank you.
Okay.
We have a strong microlithic industry here in the Northwest too, in the Columbia Plateau, and from about 8,000 years up to more recent times.
Yeah, these are microblades.
Yes.
Yeah, with those little boat-shaped paws.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's all over Northeast Asia and in Japan. I mean, I think that starts. I mean, they make bifaces and then break them and then sort of flake down the end of the broken end of the biface, don't they? To make these long, thin
the ones here we have are prepared cores.
Yeah.
They're just entirely that.
Yeah. I know that tradition in Japan and Siberia comes in just before the last glacial maximum. I presume it's an adaptation to increasingly cold climate.
You talked about Jamon and Valdivia in Ecuador.
Well, that's interesting. Yes, was there a link? That seems to have gone out of fashion, doesn't it? But the dates. I mean, I think Valdivia still must be about 3000 BC, isn't it? There's quite a lot of radiocarbon dates, I understand, from those sites in Ecuador. But whether it's the direct contact, to me, yes, Valdivia pottery and Jomon pottery don't look that much alike, I have to say. But
I agree with you on that. I've seen both.
yeah. But I understand that Valdivia and Real Alto and sites like that still have the oldest pottery, except for some of these shell-midden sites, Puerto Hormiga or something, I've forgotten now, but some of the Amazonian Lower Andean sites have pottery, don't they, going back into the early Holocene. But it doesn't seem to spread very far, as I understand it. And of course, the first farmers in the Middle East didn't use pottery. Pottery was present in East Asia because if you're cooking stuff like rice and millet, it's normally boiled rather than ground. Well, you can grind flour, of course, from them, but in ancient times it was mostly, I gather, boiled, whereas in the Middle East, of course, the wheat and barley were ground into flour rather than cooked as whole grains.
One thing I thought was interesting, I think you say 20% of Japanese individuals still carry Jamon or Ainu.
Oh yes, yes, a little bit, yes. Well, yes. I mean, the Ainu are thought to be the descendants of Jamon people. Yeah, there is a small percentage. There's certainly, I've forgotten what it is now. It's not a great, not that high. No. I mean, a lot of ancient DNA has been done in later periods of Japan, but there's none of it from the Upper Paleolithic, the time period of settling the Americas. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any at the moment.
Other questions for Dr. Bell?
Yeah. Sorry. I can't figure out how to raise my hand on this thing. Sort of for Robert, there's if you go into like Google Scholar and look up John Erlandson and Todd Braje, if you never pronounce his name, you can. A lot of the papers on the Kelp Highway are free.
Yeah, I know. I've looked at many of them. Yes, yeah.
But one of the things that I did find interesting is several years ago there's an author by the name of John Turk, not an archaeologist but an adventurer. He hopped into a kayak in Japan and over a couple seasons made it to Alaska. And he admitted right away it doesn't prove it was done, but at least he said it was, showed it was possible. So it's kind of amusing to read that book.
Yes, yeah. No, I am staggered at some of the things that are possible. Like people from Eastern Polynesia getting to South America and getting back to Polynesia again, which is
back, right?
Yeah, I mean, even though there's no trace of them in any in American peoples today, no language, well, there might be a few genes, but nobody's really looked into that in detail. But the fact that they could do it is just incredible. Even with something like Valdivia, I mean, it's not impossible. No, of course, there have been, I think. Yeah, I mean, boats blown across the Pacific, and the Spanish galleons, of course, knew all about that because they used to sail across on those winds, and I suppose they do take you down up from the Philippines around the eastern side of Japan, and then round and down into California, Acapulco, where I guess the Spanish were all going, but that those winds may well have carried people in ancient times. But when I think about the American civilizations, of course, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, did they have contact stimulation from Asia? I'm not so sure because, as I said, with Easter Island, maize, I think if there'd been Native Americans traveling in large numbers, they would have taken maize with them, and they probably would have taken some pottery as well, or at least the knowledge of it. And that never took hold. But those civilizations, I really can't see any direct evidence for contact with, say, Hindu, Buddhist, Southeast Asia, or Han Dynasty China. And a lot of things that look very similar. A lot of the feline symbolism is very similar. But is that simply shared ancestry from much earlier times, or is it actual contact? And it's very hard to know because no one's ever found any definite maize in a Chinese tomb or definite rice in a Mayan tomb, for instance. If that happened in perfect chronological situation without any questions, it would be wonderful and very interesting, but it hasn't happened yet, at least not to my knowledge.
One interesting thing here on the Northwest Coast is there's almost 200 documented junks that have washed ashore in Colombia along the coast, Washington, Oregon.
Yeah.
We don't know if anybody was alive on those junks when they arrived here or not.
This is from this is 18th, 19th century, presumably.
Right.
And these are records of the ships being found, but without any survivors. Well, yes, in other words, they might have died at sea. Well, that is possible, isn't it? Yes, of course, if they didn't have enough food. If they were just out fishing and didn't have a boat full of food, and of course, women with them, young women with them, they wouldn't have survived very long. Well, they might have survived by joining the indigenous population, but they wouldn't otherwise have survived. No, that's true.
I have another question about your the intriguing slide about the Easter Island and then Sulawesi.
Oh yes.
I mean, that's so amazing, and it's along the same lines of what before I read your book, I didn't realize. Oh yes, at one point there would have been less sea to cross. So, what do you think about that?
Well, not much less sea to cross. Oh no, I wouldn't have.
A little bit.
You mean land bridges? Well, there's no land bridge.
No. They'd have to cross, but it'd be a little less. But where does Sulawesi to?
Oh, it's in the middle of Indonesia. It's an island that used to be called Celebes. It's just the first island to the east of Borneo. It's shaped like a four-legged spider. It's a very unusual shaped island. That's the one. And that statue is in the central area, which is very difficult of access. There are no roads, and I've never actually been to where the statue is, but that's where it's located. It doesn't have a precise date. It's just standing. The villagers just keep it standing in a field, I presume, near the village. It's not buried in any archaeological deposit, and no one knows exactly how old it is. But it is remarkably interesting. Yes, it does suggest that there was a very definite tradition of how to carve a human ancestor statue. You make it into a bust, put the hands, extend the fingers, put the hands across the navel, and have a kind of angular face like those ones do. Whether that means shared history or whether it's just that way because humans carve other humans that way, I don't know. This is I remember James Ford getting into all of this debate in his book on the colonial formative, or whatever he called it. Was it common ancestry or contact, or was it because humans tend to behave the same way when they're doing the same thing? It's a difficult question, that one, actually. Yes, yeah,
Thanks. Yep. Okay. We're both wondering then.
Quick question. You go over how humans, some of the differences is the bipedal, the
yes.
large brains, the hands that can manipulate. But you do talk about larynx change. And I'm a student of Grover Krantz, and he was quite.
Oh yes, I read a few things by him. Yes, he was very interesting. Yes, he had interesting ideas.
He was at Circum-Pacific leading the paleo people, but the larynx to him was quite a change in the shape of the face and the head. Actually,
yes.
Well, he called it swallowing our face, and
well, it's speech. Yeah, I mean,
but the larynx went quite down with humans.
No, I mean, when I was talking about bipedalism and the opposable fingers and the flexible hand, I could have said speech, although I've never read a coherent answer to exactly where speech came from and who produced it. But I gather that the little hyoid bone, the Neanderthals had it, and I think some of those burials in the Cima de los Huesos, the early Neanderthals in Atapuerca in Spain, that are about 400,000 years old, I think they have hyoid bones, if I remember rightly. Because I think we do need this little independent bone, don't we? That so-called hyoid bone to produce our speech. I'm not an expert on these things, but speech.
And your fifth one was hairlessness.
Oh yes. Yeah. Well, of course, yes. That was why I was wondering about the cold tolerance. Yeah, I mean, if you're hairless and sitting in the middle of a Beijing winter with no clothing in the Jokodian caves, as Homo erectus might have done, would you freeze to death, or would you go out and kill a few animals and make a skin cloak? Because we don't know. We've got no idea. Or, I mean, were some of the early hominids, did they have much more hair than we do? Homo sapiens is hairless, but we don't really know, I suppose, about Homo erectus. That might still have been quite hairy for all we know. There's no DNA, of course, from that time period. So we'll probably never know. But with Neanderthals now, the getting the genome out is so far advanced that maybe one day someone will discover that there are genes for hair, that produce hair, body hair. Could happen.
Other comments or questions? Anybody? We certainly have time for one or two more. Okay, I'm wondering what you think about the Homo erectus and where they were located outside of the tropical area. How much insects might have been a part of their food supply, like termites? You see all over East Africa these huge termite mounds and other insects where they're hard to break into, but if you had stone tools.
Well, of course, chimpanzees certainly eat termites. We know that from David Attenborough and Jane Goodall. They use, straws. They poke straws into termite mounds and get the ants out or something. Whether hominins ever did that. But talking about insects, one thing struck me the other day, a slightly different topic, but when Europeans hit the Americas, they brought in large numbers of these epidemic diseases like smallpox and typhoid and measles and so on. But I've just noticed the other day that they probably also introduced malaria. Malaria, I gather, was not native, or at least the parasite, not the mosquito, but the parasite was not native in the New World, and it was introduced with European contact.
Wow.
And malaria would have been, as it is today, a very serious problem for people living in hot climates. Even hunter-gatherers, I'm sure, would still, malaria I know gets much worse when the populations are dense because there are far more carriers, but even with hunter-gatherers, I would imagine. There was malaria in northern Australia, for instance, not a great deal of it, but it was present amongst Aboriginal populations. And
in the Columbia River where we are, the malaria was really bad in terms of destruction. There was 80-90% of the population in the
really, and it was malaria, was it? Yeah. Okay, so it was brought in by
malaria because you had smallpox and measles, but you had a mosquito there, and up actually in macaw territories that could vector malaria. In Puget Sound, we're lucky we did not have that mosquito, so malaria wasn't a problem. But the Columbia River and up with the macaw, serious problem.
Well, the hypothesis has been that malaria was brought aboard Spanish ships in the 19th century.
Right.
Yes.
In the bowels of the ship, in the water, in the bilge, and that
I would have thought maybe before the 90s. I mean, in the 16th, I don't know, because of course the Spanish were certainly around in the 16th century, but and they would have been sailing from tropical regions. Well, of course, malaria in the Middle Ages was right up. England had malaria in the eastern, the lowlands of eastern England had malaria around the Wash. Yes, it was very widespread.
Other questions? Well, we certainly appreciate it, Dr. Bellwood, and I know it's getting late there. Might be 2:30.
It's only it's 2:00. No. It's midday.
I'm sure glad that worked. The timing,
Yes,
we have Eastern United States speakers, and it gets pretty late.
Yeah. No, I'm going down to have some lunch now. It's 2:00 in the afternoon. So
sorry for the original glitches at the beginning, but sure worked out well from Australia.
I've enjoyed giving it. I hope I didn't go on for too long, but there's so many questions, of course, and topics that are potentially of interest, but it's sometimes hard to get past them.
Thank you very much. Super fascinating book. Thank you for writing it.
No, thank you very much.
He read your book. He was all excited, and
all right.
I know Matt got it from the library and so forth, but I'll look forward to the new version.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Oh, I didn't know there's a new version coming out.
Oh no, not of the Odyssey book. No.
Okay.
No, there's a new version of the book I wrote called First Migrants.
Oh, great. I'll be looking for that one. Thank you.
It won't be out till next year. I'm just finishing it now.
Updated. And you have great maps. You say you have somebody at the university that helps you.
I do them myself. Well, I don't know how to use Adobe Illustrator, but I get the background maps from the GIS people in ANU. The rivers and the relief and the coastlines. I couldn't do that myself. They have to come from databases. But all the lettering and arrows and boxes and this sort of stuff, I put on myself. Yeah, it's much easier than getting someone else to do it, because then you can fiddle with it as you go along and keep changing it if you want to. And,
Plus, when you update your books, you need to.
Yeah, I just update the maps. Yeah, they're all in Adobe Illustrator, and then you can save it to JPEG or something like that. And,
well, if you're in the Seattle area again, let me know.
Yeah. Well, I'm now 81, so I don't know how much more traveling I've got ahead of me. I'm going to Vietnam, and I'm going to the UK in July. But I might have to start giving it a bit of a rest soon, I think.
We got the big game hunters here with the whalers, Nia Bay. You can meet some whalers, and nothing more big game hunting than that.
Oh, well, okay. All right, then, Dale, thanks very much for inviting me. And I'll and I need to send you some bank details. Is that right?
Yes, please do that. And like I say, I'll send you one of it in my books. But I think we have to do that through your bank account.
Okay. If you want to send a book, you'll need an address, a postal address too, won't you?
We'll put you on as an associate. So if you ever want to, so you'll know what talks are coming up. If you want to come,
that would be nice. That's nice.
That one on by Rick Connect, a very interesting site in the Arctic.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And
John
he's
Victorious, I've met him, I think, yes.
very happy we have 2 hours because he has a lot of pictures of amazing art.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and
Thank you.
very much.
again one day. Okay, I will click on leave.
Yes, please. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks. And
Thank you.
have
A
a
lot
good
to
Thanks
think
so
about.
much. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.